Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. Electricity tariffs are under the spotlight again after a 54 billion rand settlement between Nersa and Eskom. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss the reaction to the behind closed doors arrangement. Hi, Terence.
Hi, Chanel.
Electricity tariffs are heating up yet again.
Yes, last year and early this year was really all about electricity tariffs because we had the sort of every 3 years or so, depending on how the cycle's working, we have these big public hearings into the tariffs. Eskom asks for, on this last case, it asked for a 36% increase. So there was obviously massive pushback at the public hearings. And in January, at the end of January, Nersa made its determination. It granted Eskom 12.74% for the current year that we're currently in. And then it had, in the 2 outer years, it was 5.36 and 6.19%. So that's really, it's based on a formula that Eskom sort of applies for allowable revenue. And Nersa and the public interrogate it, and then there's a sort of a determination. It was a begrudging acceptance, really, that we have a price path that was almost acceptable, not really. We've had so many price hikes going back over more than 10 years, and it's been really steep and very difficult for households and for businesses to absorb these hikes. So we had this arrangement. Then it emerged almost immediately, that Eskom said, look, the way the regulatory asset base has been calculated is not right in their view, and that's led to a lower depreciation charge in the formula, and therefore they're going to be looking at this very carefully when the reasons for decision come out. Subsequent to the reasons for decision coming out, they did take this to the court for a review and a setting aside and for a redetermination by Nersa. Now, we've seen that story before, and generally Nersa's always come out as the loser in these court cases because it's been found that it hasn't applied the formula correctly. And it does so possibly under huge political pressure, to try to find ways to ensure that the lowest increase possible is passed through to Eskom and passed on to the consumer. But be that as it may, whenever Eskom takes Nersa to court, Eskom generally wins. And it's done this several times, whether it's been on past allowable revenue applications, regulatory clearing account applications, and we've even had a court case specifically on what should be allowed in the regulatory asset base back in 2022. So this has a history. So I think Nersa knowing that it had made errors in the calculation, opted for a settlement, so didn't oppose, rather looked for a settlement. I think Eskom was looking for something like 107 billion to recover. In the end, a 54 billion, as you said, settlement was reached. Again, this was on the agenda, a very diligent reporting by MoneyWeb. It was on the agenda of the electricity subcommittee. It was suddenly taken off the agenda. It was then put back on, but as not a non-public meeting. So, usually Nersa meetings are public. You can watch them through social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. So this was closed. We couldn't see it. And then suddenly we have this 54 billion announcement. And this changes the tariff price path. So this year remains at 12.74%. But the outer years, so from April next year and the following subsequent April, instead of what we were going to get, the 5.36, we're going to get 8.76, and then instead of the 6.19, we're going to get 8.83% hikes. And this is only to recover 35 billion of the 54 billion in those 2 years. The rest will have to be recovered in the outer years. Now, we also have to remember there's a number of regulatory clearing accounts RCA applications that have been approved, and they run into billions of rands, but there's been no announcement yet on how they will be liquidated and when they'll be liquidated, over what period. So if we add some of those that are coming through, and there's varying amounts, but there's at least 8 billion that needs to be recovered, and there's more to come potentially, and I'm sure Eskom is just about to submit its next RCA. So there's more to add to these tariffs. So we don't have certainty anymore. So that's basically what's happened, and that's why tariffs are once again very much in the spotlight.
What has the reaction been to the settlement?
Well, I think it's, the reaction's very bad. People are really finding it really difficult at the moment. The economy is not, uh, growing at the pace and recovering at a pace that we had hoped through the operation of Vulindlela reforms. Certain sectors under extreme pressure. We're seeing retrenchment notices all over the place. And we're also seeing that with the institution of tariffs by the Trump administration in the US. That's having a big effect on potentially on certain industries in South Africa. So the reaction from business has been swift and very hostile. Big business has said this is just unacceptable and we need a new way of calculating tariffs because we just can't have, one, the uncertainty, and two, these steep tariff increases. We really are struggling for sustainability. Those energy-intensive businesses that sometimes up to 40% of their costs are electricity, they are really not happy, not only with the settlement, but they are not happy with the nature of how the settlement was reached. Again, no public hearing, behind closed doors. This is not really the way South Africa reaches conclusions around the tariffs. So they are objecting, the energy-intensive user group, and they actually asked for a reopen of the tariff. Now, whether that's wise, because, we'll have to see, when Eskom actually shows you the numbers and runs the numbers, it's always, Nersa generally gives them a lower increase. And if we are to stick strictly to the formula, they could be coming back and sure, have a reopener, we'll go higher, But, also I think there's a feeling that politically that Eskom's fairly constrained and asking for much more. And there's also a feeling from the public that really, has Eskom really sharpened its pencil? Is it running efficiently as it should? Has it sort of mopped up all the corruption and waste that we know has existed in the utility? So there's total trust deficit from the public. So the reaction's not only one of unhappiness, it's of hostility. And I think we've only just started to see the reaction.
There are several signs that affordability pressures are rising.
Yeah, I mean, in the business front, it's very clear. Those energy-intensive businesses across the board, we're seeing quite a lot of action around restructuring. And we're seeing Section 189 notices going from steel companies, ArcelorMittal being the most, visible, but there's a lot of ferrochrome action. There's a lot of concern in the automotive sector at the moment. Manufacturing is not recovering as we had hoped it would. So there's a lot of distress in business. So we can see the electricity price affordability issues are biting there. How some of the big businesses have responded and how government has responded is through these negotiated price agreements. Here again, there's a lot of unhappiness because, one, they're behind closed doors. The settlements are never published. We just get a globular figure. And if you look at Eskom's most recent MYPD application, MPAs were a big feature of that, Wasn't the only feature, but in raising the prices. But what happens is someone has to pay for these negotiated pricing settlements. And it's those of us who consume the standard Eskom tariff, which is passed on through to municipalities, which also add their own surcharges, etc. And also those direct standard Eskom customers. But MPA customers, when they get a special deal, who pays for it? It's the rest of the consumers. So there's not a lot of happiness about those. But on the other hand, these businesses are under extreme pressure and are closing furnaces. And they are important export contributors, foreign exchange earners, employers. So you can understand why government wants some sort of lever here. But it's done in a very opaque manner. Then we can see the affordability pressures for residents. I mean, Eskom's arrear debt, and this is what municipalities owe Eskom, has, it was reported earlier this year, it's breached the 100 billion rand level. That's really showing, okay, there's theft, there's vandalism, there's all sort of malfeasance as well that should be dealt with, and there's efforts to try and deal with that. And there's a culture of non-payment, which is a big problem. But there's also an affordability issue that's coming through, and it's coming And that's just sort of translating into less and less people being able to pay and therefore looking ways to bypass their meter. So these affordability pressures are real. The problem is Eskom is saying they are nowhere near cost-reflective tariffs. We've been pretty slow in getting sort of visibility of what true tariffs are through a market mechanism. That is coming next year, but even that's going to take, it's going to be limited in giving us sort of price, giving us a price point that the market is settling at and that it is fair. So there's a lot of loose ends. So it's very difficult to see how we're going to reach some sort of affordability balance. So on the one hand, they're trying to offer energy intensive users there's incentive through the MPAs, the negotiated price settlements, but that the rest of us pay for that, and we're also under pressure. And on the other hand, we've got this massive amount of theft. So it's really a big problem, or theft and non-payment. So it's really a big problem, and I'm not sure we've got our head around it. I'm not sure enough attention is actually being given to it.
Thank you. That's the second Tax Show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.